Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome you to yet another interactive session of Caucus, the discussion forum of Hindu College. Today, we have the rare privilege of hosting Professor Peter Burke. Professor Burke is a British polymath. He retired as Emeritus Professor of Cultural History from the University of Cambridge. Over the course of his prolific academic career, Professor Burke broadened his scholarly endeavors beyond history to engage with social theory and cultural theory. He has employed insights from his studies in history to contemporary issues, such as his recent book, Ignorance, A Global History, wherein he moves beyond his earlier works on the history of knowledge to analyzing the history of its limitations and their impact. Professor Burke has published hundreds of articles and chapters and 30 books. His works have been translated into 33 languages. He is a fellow of the British Academy and a member of the Academia Europea. In 1998, he was awarded the Erasmus Medal of the European Academy. He has also been awarded honorary doctorates by the Universities of Lund, Copenhagen, Bucharest, Zurich, Brussels, and Oviedo. He is an honorary professor of the National University of Colombia and honorary fellow of St. John's College, Oxford. Sir, we welcome you. Thank you so much for taking our time for this. I would now like to invite our president, Pushkar Pandey, to discuss a little bit about Caucus and what we represent.
Thank you very much, Animesh. I apologize for being yet another barrier between the audience and Professor Burke, but convention compels me to say a few words about ourselves and about why we chose to invite Professor Burke for this session. So Caucus, the discussion forum of Hindu College, it's a 17-year-old society. We initially started off by focusing on foreign affairs and international relations and economics and politics, but gradually over the years, we have also set a track record of hosting eminent scholars on sociology, social studies, cultural studies, and so on. Now, it's my firm belief that history, as E.P. Thompson put it, is the master discipline, the discipline in which all other subjects blend. And I think Professor Burke's academic career is testament to how he gradually started off by writing a book on the Italian Renaissance, a book which we had to consult, undergraduate students of history had to consult during their third semester at Delhi University. And by the time we'll move on to our masters, we'll have to read Professor Burke's on cultural theory and what is cultural history. So it is indeed a rare privilege for us to be interacting with Professor Burke. Thank you so much for taking out time from your schedule and agreeing to address us today. Mr. Burke, I'll request you to take the proceedings from now. Thank you so much, sir.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this session, and thank you, both of you, for the generous introduction to my work. And what I'd like to do today is to speak to you about my career as a historian and also about the history of cultural history. My career has somehow got entangled with this history, especially in the three different phases of its development. Cultural history began as the history of the arts and sciences, and then came the history of popular culture, and finally came the historical anthropology of different ways of life, different cultures. And I became interested in these three ways of writing cultural history in chronological order, and I still believe in the value of all of them. I wouldn't say that one of them is better than the other, but each has its own advantages and disadvantages. And speaking more generally, I want to suggest that cultural innovation usually consists not of replacing something old with something new, as you might replace a machine, but producing something new that will coexist with the old and then will interact with it. And in this case, the three kinds of cultural history that I just distinguished, they all continue to exist, and they are interacting and producing, if you like, new combinations. I still try to contribute to all three of them. So cultural history in the first sense, the history of the arts, sciences, philosophy, music, it was already written under that name, at least in German, in the late 18th century. And the masterpiece in the genre, I believe it's generally accepted by historians, is a book published as long ago as 1860. It's a study of the culture of the Renaissance in Italy by the Swiss historian Jakob Burckhardt. He called it just an essay. That was him being modest. And he was trying to reconstruct the mentality of the Italian elite at this time and showing how different it was from medieval attitudes and values. Now, this kind of history was not written for students. It was written for the general public in the 19th century. It was most popular in the German-speaking world. And it was not taken seriously by the growing number of professional historians in the 19th century, again, especially in Germany. So the professional historians were led by Leopold von Ranke. He had wide ambitions. He wrote about the religion as well as politics. But his followers reduced Ranke's project to a political history viewed from above and based on official documents. I believe that Marx once said, I'm not a Marxist. Ranke could equally well have said, I'm not a Rankian. His students, they shrank his project. Now, in the writing of history, every generation does it a bit differently, but at the same time, some major changes take a long time to happen. They take longer to happen in some places, for example, some universities compared to others. So, as a student, I read history at Oxford. As late as 1957, when I arrived to study the subject, the history taught at Oxford was rather insular because it was focused very much on the history of England, not even Scotland or Wales or Ireland. And it was also narrowly political in the sense of what was done by great men, in other words, history viewed from above. There was an alternative, economic history. Economic historians were in a minority, but they were beginning to make their voices felt. Social history was sort of attached to economic history. There were some history departments in other universities. There was one department of history, and there was another department of economic and social. But it was always and social, as if it didn't matter as much as the economic. But in the Oxford system, there was, happily for me, one major exception to the dominance of politics. Every student had to take a special subject. I know this is true in so many universities. It's an excellent idea. In your final year, you take a subject you study in more detail. It must be based on original sources. So there's a whole list of special subjects, and we were free to choose one from about 12 options. And one option, curiously enough, a very old option, was the Italian Renaissance. And because I love the art of this period, I'm a Londoner. My childhood, I spent a lot of time at the National Gallery, in British Museum, and so on. So I chose that topic. And in response, this is the great thing about the college system, my college gave me money so that I could spend a lot of time in Italy, first to learn the language, because I didn't know a word of Italian, and secondly, to view outstanding works of art in Venice, in Florence, in Rome. Now, if I was so interested in art, you might wonder why didn't I take an art history course at the university? And the answer is as I wanted to go to Oxford, and Oxford didn't have a course on art history. What was new, very new, 2 years before I arrived, they appointed the first professor of art history ever, a brilliant man, German, called Edgar Wendt, and who'd taught in Germany, but in 1933, because he was Jewish, he was forced to emigrate, and he chose to come to England. But curiously enough, Wynne didn't really want students of his own. He didn't want to found an art history department. What he really wanted to do, did very well, was to lecture to the whole university, anybody that wanted to come. And he did this on the Italian Renaissance. And everybody came. That is, not 100% of the students, but I knew people who were studying chemistry, studying philosophy, mathematics, studying English literature. They all came. So much so, there was no room in the university that was big enough to hold all the people that wanted to come to the weekly lectures. So Professor Wendt ended up giving his lectures in the Oxford Playhouse, the one place with enough space for seats. Now, in fact, I went to seminars as well, and as a result, I became an enthusiast for the study of the Italian Renaissance. I started a doctorate, but there was no time to finish it, because at this time in England, now we reached the early 1960s, 7 new universities were founded by the government. And the first one to open, the University of Sussex at Brighton, had a different organization, because the founders believed in an interdisciplinary approach. They didn't want students to specialize as much as is normal now. So 50% of the time of the student, they studied their major subject, but the other half, that went on a variety of subjects. Not any subject the student felt like studying, that's the American system, but other subjects that the organizers thought would connect well with the major subject of each student and make everything easier to understand. I was very excited when I heard this or read about it in the newspaper. I thought I had to apply. I must have a job at this university. And I applied and I got the job. So the next thing was I was giving lectures on the Italian Renaissance. And after giving lectures for 2 or 3 years on this subject, it occurred to me it would be nice to write a book about it. And I wanted to have a distinctive approach. And I thought the social history of culture. There was a book in existence in England called The Social History of Art. I don't think it's such a marvelous book. It's written by quite a hardline Marxist called Arnold Hauser. I think it's a bit too crude, but the enterprise is very important and very interesting. So I thought I could try to do this perhaps in my own way. And I called the book Culture and Society in the Italian Renaissance, and that was deliberate homage to a British intellectual, Raymond Williams. I don't say English because he was a Welshman, and he published this book in 1958, analyzing the concepts of culture and society, and I found it inspiring when I was a student. Now, Williams was a Marxist, but of a rather undogmatic kind. Indeed, he thought that it was a big mistake to treat culture as a kind of superstructure. And so his Marxism was what we called in the 60s open Marxism. I admired him. I appreciated the Marxian approach, maybe Marxian rather than Marxist. But I was also interested in an alternative, the approach of a group of French historians to history. The French historians associated with this journal, Annales. In those days, it was called Economies, Societies, Civilizations. Civilizations being the word the French used at that time when we English use the word culture. Curiously, maybe it's the American influence. Now the French do talk about culture, but they didn't at this point. And I remember asking myself, how would these historians approach the Renaissance if they decided to write a book about it? Obviously, you would study what kind of people the artists and writers were. Obviously, you would study who their patrons were, because the patronage system was the dominant system. There was an art market, but it was very small and very rare in most countries. That there was a bit of an Italian art market, but really it's not the important thing. So the masterpieces of Leonardo and Michelangelo and Raphael were not produced to be sold in art galleries on a commercial basis. The initiative was with the patron, and he invited the artist to do something, and the artist very often had to do exactly what he was asked to do. So at Sussex, the idea of culture was very much a centre of attention. They even founded what we called a school of studies called Cultural and Community Studies. And somebody organized in the history, not a department, we were against departments, but the history group arranged a series of lectures on different approaches to different key concepts. And I was invited to give a talk about the idea of culture. So I did, and I pointed out that it's a metaphor from agriculture. It's the cultivation of the mind in the way that farmers cultivate the soil. And this idea goes back to classical Greece and Rome. Afterwards, a colleague of mine, Ratvanaj Guha, you probably know more about him than I do, but he was one of the first people to teach history at Sussex along with me. He said it's the same thing in Sanskrit. And he wrote me a little letter where he, in his distinctive green ink, he wrote the word in the appropriate characters, which I can't read, but he told me that that was the word they were already using in ancient India. Now, sorry, I've got the pages wrong. Just turn these things over. So after my book on the Renaissance was published, I needed to think about another topic of research. And by this time, Edward Thompson had published his famous book on the making of the English working class, where, somewhat to the surprise of some readers, he devoted a good deal of attention to working class culture. So much so, he was criticized by fellow Marxists for what they called culturalism. Now, Edward Thompson was nothing if not aggressive, so he hit back in characteristic fashion by accusing his critics of economism, in the sense of a crude reduction of culture as nothing but a response to economic trends. So at this time, the idea that there was something called popular culture and that it would be worthwhile some historians paying attention to it, this idea was spreading slowly. To give you an idea of the obstacles, let me tell you that in 1959, Eric Hobsbawm published a book about jazz. So he called it the jazz scene. So it was about the culture of jazz, the sort of places that people played in, and so on. But Hobsbawm didn't put his name on the cover. He pretended the book had been written by somebody else, and he signed it Francis Newton. That was a clue to some people, because the original Francis Newton was a black communist American jazz trumpeter, but only the jazz enthusiasts would know that. So, interesting question is, why should Eric Hobsbawm be so keen to disguise his identity? Now, the point I believe, since he was not yet a professor, he was afraid to put his name on the book in case it blocked his chances of promotion, because in 1959 in Britain, the study of jazz was not yet academically respectable. In similar fashion, film studies were respectable, but the 60s would be a revolution, and among so many other changes, would make it possible for professors in universities to publish books on those subjects, that it became accepted that the topic was worthy of academic attention. Now, for example, in 1964, the Birmingham Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies was founded, and Stuart Hall, who soon became its director, began making his well-known contribution to cultural theory, engaging with French structuralism on one side, and as well as with Marxism on the other. And like Williams, Stuart Hall was a prominent member of the British New Left. Like Perry Anderson, and I made friends with two other members of the New Left at this time, Raphael Samuel, a charismatic figure and the founder of History Workshop, and Gareth Stedman Jones, whom I still know. So in my milieu, it was taken for granted that popular culture was worth studying. And so I decided I would now investigate it and make a contribution to its history, defining popular culture as the attitudes and values of ordinary people and their expression or embodiment, both in material artifacts and in performances. Later on, we would say practices, which is still wider. So the problem was to decide when and where should I focus. I wanted to stay with Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, because that was my full-time job, teaching the history of Europe in those days. I thought about focusing on Italy, but if you were writing about the 16th, 17th centuries, Italy doesn't really exist. I mean, the regions are autonomous. So it would make much better sense to focus on a region. I thought for some time, maybe Tuscany, or maybe the region around Venice. But meanwhile, in preparation for the serious research, I started reading around, and I discovered that although popular culture and its history was a new idea for historians, there was another group of scholars to whom it was extremely familiar and had been since the 19th century, and that is the folklorists. Even now in England, the study of folklore is not taken seriously in universities. I have to say England and not Britain, because in Scottish universities, Welsh universities, and in Northern Irish universities, folklore is taken very seriously indeed, as it is in Scandinavia and Eastern Europe. So discovering that so much work had been done on the history of popular culture in Scandinavia, I thought I must somehow get to know about this, and I applied for a grant and got one so I could visit the open-air museums in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, which display the peasant culture, especially of the 18th century. They have transported cottages from their original habitat to display them in this kind of cottage park, and fill them with the artifacts, chairs, tables, even grandfather clocks, which the richer peasants would have had at that time. Anyway, I started to learn Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian. Luckily, they're all very similar, so that by the time you've learned to read one, you can more or less work out the other ones. And then I would go and interview the curators of the museums and ask them questions, and they were very helpful indeed. It was very, very nice to be welcomed in this way when I was, in a way, invading their field, but they were pleased to see a foreigner taking their museum seriously. But in the course of research, what I discovered, this was the big thing, was that folk music, folk tales, popular images did not respect political frontiers. They circulated widely throughout Europe. They might change the details, as a particular story of the king in disguise to discover what his subjects think about him. So in England, the king was Henry VIII. But then in Russia, the king was Ivan the Terrible. Same story, different decoration, if you like. But this had a big consequence. And it was possible, indeed more than possible, it was important for somebody to try to write about European popular culture and its changes as a whole, because the folklorists, indeed, who owed their jobs to the foundation of national museums as part of the movement of nationalism and the independence of a number of European countries. And they were paid to focus on their national popular culture. An outsider, on the other hand, who's not working in a museum of folklore, but in a university, could simply take the choice, as I did, and write a book called Popular Culture in Early Modern Europe, meaning really Europe, because in the 60s and 70s, when English people said Europe, first of all, they didn't include themselves. So Europe began in France. And secondly, it was really only Western Europe. And I was determined to write about the whole of Europe. I said from Galway, which happens to be where my father's family come from, to the Urals. It's quite a wide area. And they speak about 60 languages between them. I suppose that's nothing by Indian standards, but for a European to hear that 60 languages are spoken on your continent, that really means something. And so this is what I decided to do. The book was published in 1978, just before I left Sussex to go and teach European history, but this time at the University of Cambridge. Now, from the point of view of cultural studies, I think the following anecdote is good evidence. On arrival, I introduced myself to my colleagues in the history faculty, because there's a separate faculty in Cambridge, unlike Sussex. And I was surprised by their surprise when I said, I'm a cultural historian. I mean, I think some of them actually did say, what's that? I mean, as if this was something normal people hadn't heard of. 20 or 30 years later, still working in the faculty, I noticed somehow that times had changed and that most of my younger colleagues now wanted to call themselves cultural historians, even if they were doing what I thought was the history of business or the history of diplomacy. They were still saying, but it's a cultural history of diplomacy. So it's a quiet revolution in the writing and, of course, the lecturing and the reading of history. Now, as the interest in it grew and as more of one's colleagues took up this topic, of course, there were more debates about how to do it. My overview of popular culture was sometimes criticized, not as I expected, for being too wide, but on occasion it was criticized for being too narrow. That is, they didn't put it this way, but I will. I had been focusing on the popular equivalents of high culture, like folk music on the analogy of classical music, folk tales on the analogy of literature, and so on. The alternative to do this was to focus on the whole way of life, a phrase that had been popularized in the 60s by Raymond Williams. And of course, describing a whole way of life is exactly what cultural anthropologists do. And for this reason, I had some sympathy with the criticism because I'd been reading the work of cultural anthropologists such as Clifford Geertz for some years at that time. In fact, I can boast, if you like, I practiced anthropology much earlier, though at the time I didn't know that I was doing it. Before I went to university, I had to do national service. It still existed in England at that time. So I joined the British Army and they sent me to Singapore to work as a clerk. But it was in a local regiment. It was a regiment 90% composed of Malays, a few Tamils, a few Cantonese. Now, I'd entered the army immediately after leaving school. I hadn't traveled much outside Britain with my parents. They took me to Paris once. So, in that sense, I was a very innocent ex-schoolboy, and now I was plunged very rapidly into two different cultures, the Malay culture of the regiment and the mainly Chinese and partly hybrid culture of the city of Singapore. It all seemed totally strange and quite fascinating. In order to cope with it, maybe you could say this may have been a response to culture shock. I started to take notes on everything that I saw and heard. And I kept a diary for the first and last time in my life, which was mainly about these strange sounds and smells and tastes and the way in which the Malays behaved and what it was like to enter a Chinese shop and bargain for something because it didn't have a fixed price as it would in England and so on. So when I got to Oxford and read books on anthropology, I realized I'd been doing what anthropologists call fieldwork, which effectively is just going somewhere that you don't come from and hanging out with the locals and observing everything and asking them questions and taking notes and finally writing a description of what you call the culture in the case of Clifford Geertz of Bali, or the culture of the Azandi in Central Africa, which the most famous English British anthropologist Edward Evans Pritchard did, and so on. Now, in the age of gears, which I mean, by which I mean the 1970s, 1980s, when enthusiasm for his work across a range of disciplines was at its height, history and anthropology appeared to be converging, and a number of historians, including myself, started to call ourselves historical anthropologists. Later, I thought it would have been better to call ourselves anthropological historians, because we were using the methods of history. We can't interview dead people, so we had to use the conventional traditional historical method of using documents. But the questions that we formulated were inspired by anthropologists who practice this different method of living with people and talking to them. And some of the anthropologists became interested in history. And in that way, it looked as if there was a convergence. Maybe there would even have been some kind of merger. But now, looking back on all this from the perspective of the early 21st century, history and anthropology looked to me like two trains. They were approaching one another, and then they passed and went on going in opposite directions. Now, the reason I say that is above all connected to the word, the concept of culture. It was the anthropologists really launched the term culture. In Britain, one of the first anthropologists ever in the late 19th century wrote a book about culture and defined it as a way of life. But a number of anthropologists in Britain and the United States and elsewhere became uncomfortable with the concept of culture. And now they want to abandon it, or in their own words, go beyond it. In France, where in the 60s, Claude Lévi-Strauss became so famous for this distinction between nature and culture, his ex-students are devoting books to saying that we have to go beyond this distinction, that it's misleading in many ways. For example, if you study the tribes in the Amazon, you find that they regard themselves as, together with certain animals, as one kind of being, and then the plants and insects are different. So they make a dichotomy, but they don't make it in the place that Lévi-Strauss made it between nature and culture. Now, I sympathize in the sense I understand why it is that anthropologists want to get rid of the word culture, because it's really rather vague. And actually, in a famous interview that Raymond Williams once gave in later life, and they asked him some questions about the book Culture and Society, and he says at one point, I know I've written a lot about this, but there are times when I wish I'd never heard of the damn word. And the reason that he says it is it's got so many meanings, it's so slippery, difficult to work with. So I say, I sympathize with this, but I don't agree with trying to throw the concept overboard. Another reason for sympathizing is that whereas the term culture was in relatively restricted use in the 50s and 60s, mainly academic, it got to be used in more and more widely, especially by journalists writing about drug culture, gun culture, the culture of fear, and so on. And I think the climax for one anthropologist, a German I knew, who was doing his fieldwork in London among several different ethnic groups that lived in the same part of London. And he would ask them, why do you follow this particular custom? And then they would say, oh, it's part of our culture. So the term culture no longer being used only by the investigator, it had reached the investigated as well. And in the course of this, it widened its meaning and it became less precise. The obvious question to ask at this point is, what is not culture? And actually, not very long ago, a year or two ago, I was asked by a Dutch historian to contribute to a volume he was editing about cultural history. So that seemed nice, and I sent in my essay. And when the book was published, I received my copy, and to my rather surprise, had this title in Dutch, actually, that culture is everything. But I don't think culture is everything. That is, I don't think we should use the word culture to include absolutely everything. Because if culture is everything, we don't need the word. We've already got the word everything, after all. But I told him I would have been much happier if he'd chosen the title, Culture is Everywhere. Because culture is not confined to a particular domain or activity, so that you can say, I'd like to go and do culture this afternoon. But it is concerned with symbols wherever they're found. You find symbols in painting, you find symbols in literature, you find a symbolic aspect of eating or of wearing clothes. There's a utilitarian aspect as well, but there's always the symbolic aspect. So in that sense, culture is everywhere. And another problem with the anthropologists' decision is that they agree to criticize the concept of culture, but they totally disagree about what concept should replace it. I tried to make a list, but it's too long, so I spare you that. And actually, I believe that the job that the word culture does, it is essentially to function as a kind of conceptual glue, that is, it links different activities or activities that are normally seen as different, but in important ways they're connected. But now, if another concept or if another word is created to do this job, it would have to be as vague as the word culture itself, or it wouldn't do the job properly. So we might as well stay with the vague word we've got rather than replace it with something which is no more precise. Now, moving as talking about my career, moving closer to the present, it's clear that cultural history, which used to be more or less confined to Europe and the Americas, South America as well as North, it's increasingly pursued in Asia and in Africa, not to mention Australia, New Zealand. And interestingly, I think scholars who either come from Japan or study Japan have been in the lead in the study of popular culture. I think that it's interesting to ask oneself, if one sees a new trend in historical studies, why is this happening? Should we explain it in terms internal to the discipline, like a few people discovering that something's been neglected and therefore they should pay attention to it? Or is the explanation really from outside the discipline? Because it's a commonplace, but it's one needs to remember. As the present changes, people, without even trying, find themselves looking at the past from new angles. And so if there's a new trend in writing history, it's very likely to be related to something that's being debated now, with the obvious example being now the history of the environment. If there hadn't been this environmental crisis and environmental movement, he wouldn't have had so many books written in the last 20 years about the history of different bits of the earth. So in the case of this, the Japan problem, I would say this is a result of the unexpected success in the 21st century of items of Japanese popular culture which have gone global. Manga, anime, Nintendo, and so on. And so that encourages historians to ask them, well, what was Japanese popular culture like in the 1930s? Or what was it like in the 1860s? What was it like in the 17th century? And so books and articles on all this are coming out. But it's too late for me to change, I think. And I continue to work on Western cultural history while happily reading books on cultural history in other places. And for the last decades, really, I have concentrated attention on the history of knowledge, or to use the increasingly common phrase, the history of different cultures of knowledge, which may be divided by different countries, but can also, and even more obviously, be divided by different disciplines. But I don't want to write the history of a single discipline. I'm interested in problems that cut across disciplines, including the rise of specialization itself. Now, one of my books discusses the distinctive contribution to knowledge made by the Jewish exiles of the 1930s, that not sufficiently to say when these scholars left Germany and other countries and came to the United States or Britain, they obviously went on making a contribution to knowledge, whether in the sciences or the humanities. My question was, could it have been a distinctive contribution? Did they make a different kind of contribution in their second homeland, but because of the problems of adjusting, of living between two cultures? And I decided the answer was yes. And then the next book was about polymaths. So scholars who know about more than one discipline, sometimes several different ones. Did they make an original contribution? Because they can see the big picture more clearly than more specialized scholars. And my conclusion was that polymaths are responsible for a higher number of innovations, new interpretations, new discoveries. And one reason for this, maybe not the only reason, maybe they've simply got more flexible minds, but one reason is that they approach the second and third disciplines that they learn with the mental habits, the habitus that they learned in their first one. It's likely they studied their first discipline in a conventional manner by going to university. It's likely, though, that they learn their second and third discipline by teaching themselves. And so they come, let's say, well, I can give you an example. I had this friend at Sussex who was the professor of biology, and he was well known to be one of the most innovative English biologists of his generation. That is, he was called John Maynard Smith. He was at Cambridge in the 1930s. And he once said to me that if he made a serious contribution to biology, it was because he hadn't studied it at Cambridge. That wasn't a rude remark about Cambridge. He'd studied at Cambridge, but he'd studied engineering. And then when he graduated in engineering, he became interested in biology. Polymaths are people with much more curiosity than all other people, I think. And so they're not satisfied to stay with what they were trained in. Anyway, he started to write a PhD on the evolution of the flight of birds. But he started to look at this problem with the eyes of an aeronautical engineer. That is, somebody that's used to thinking about problems of stability and problems of maneuverability. But the biologists hadn't thought about this when they were studying the evolution of birds. So he makes a breakthrough, becomes quite famous in his discipline. So that's an illustration of if you like, the collision between two cultures of knowledge. He innovates because he has a knowledge culture that the other biologists don't have. It leads him to ask different questions or find different answers or something like this. Anyway, I continue to think of this form of cultural history as a kind of anthropology of the past, field work in the territory of the many different tribes who inhabit the academic world, each with their own customs, which they tend to think is the best way of doing things, without realizing that their neighbors think exactly the same thing, but have different customs. Now, I learned that when a given topic becomes familiar to you, it no longer stimulates so many new ideas. And I wondered, is there a way to fight this? And I decided at a certain point, you should try and turn it upside down. And this is done by historians from time to time. Think of historians of memory. This is one of the big growth areas of historical research and writing in the last 30, 40 years. And then one day, a historian thinks, let's turn this upside down. I want to write a history of forgetting, because that gives you new insights into the memory process. And for exactly this reason, after writing several consecutive books on the history of knowledge, I decided it was time to study the history of ignorance. Nobody seemed to have thought of writing about it, and it turned out that there was much too much to say. Ignorance is a vast subject, and I only touched the surface. And that's my latest book. Of course, I'm working on another one, but because I haven't finished it, this may well be the best moment to stop speaking and allow time for you to ask me the questions, which I'm sure have come to mind while you were listening. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, sir. We'll be opening up for questions now. People, you can send your questions in the chat box. And Dia, are you here? Please read out the questions for Professor Burke, whichever questions are sent in the chat box.
I've got the box open, so as soon as I see one, I'll read it aloud in case several questions appear, and then you will all want to know which one I'm trying to answer at any one moment.
All right. Thank you so much. Uh, So the first question that we have is, how do you evaluate the invention of tradition, as Terence Ranger and Eric Hobsbawm put it? There is a myriad of cultural narratives that are being spun and those that have been spun throughout history. What do you think the source of these narratives is, and who do you believe really owns culture as we perceive it?
Okay, this is quite a long. Are you the one that asked about folklore? Because I've got
No, no, this
something's
is not.
appeared on the screen, quite a question that's almost too long to read out about. You emphasize the importance of folklore in understanding history. Um, and, and folklore has contributed to the emergence of chauvinism or so-called religious nationalism in different parts of the world. Although the literate or elite sections of society might be aware of the distinction between cultural symbolism and political manipulation, the majority of citizens remain vulnerable to attempts by political groups to exploit folklore for their own purposes. What's your take on this? Frankly, I'm not as confident as you about the literate or elite sections of society. I think that probably all of us at some time in our lives have been vulnerable to attempts by political groups to exploit folklore among other forms of propaganda. You have to have your guard up. You really have to practice having your guard up, not to be taken in on occasion by the most fluent speakers who offer arguments of this kind. And that is the importance of we, and we are defined as a group separate from they, and they are seen as either hostile or as inferior, and that leads to political violence. So I'm not saying that all folklore is a good thing, but precisely because folklore is important, it has to be studied, and it should be studied not only in the present, but also in the past. So there's a place for historians alongside folklorists. And indeed, really, the distinction between what used to be called folklore and popular culture is a very open one. Frankly, if people had been thinking about these problems, they would never have chosen two separate words, folklore on one side, popular culture on the other. And in each case, you have to say, who are the folk, who are the people? And it then turns out that there's the danger of assuming that everybody in a given nation thinks the same way, has the same values, when we know empirically, just from everyday experience, that every culture is the location of variety. People have different opinions, different values. So yeah, basically that is my take on that particular question. Now it says 7 new messages. So I better move to another one. Here we go. Second question, in your view, how can societies address collective ignorance to prevent decision-making blind spots, as seen in historical examples like Chernobyl? Yeah, collective ignorance, and in particular one kind of collective ignorance, that is organizational ignorance, has caused a lot of problems. In any large organization, especially a large and hierarchical organization, it's extremely likely that the people at the bottom don't know what the people at the top are thinking, and vice versa. So in a factory, the boss doesn't know what the people on the shop floor know, just as the people on the shop floor don't have the big picture that the boss has of the place, the firms he's competing with, and so on. Of course, in theory, you can say this is a role for middle management. But that's easier said than done, because it may be not too difficult for the managers to pass the boss's knowledge downwards. But when it comes to telling the boss what the workers know, including what the workers think of him, they may hesitate. You don't want to lose your job. Who would have told Stalin that the 5-year plan wasn't going very well? He never got the knowledge because nobody dared say something like that. Quite right from their point of view, because they would be in the gulag within 24 hours. But that means big hierarchical institutions have these problems. And Chernobyl was managed by a large hierarchical group. And when it is fairly clear that some people knew about some of the defects in the power plant, which led to the explosion. But they weren't prepared to take the possible consequences of reporting on this to their superiors. So your real question was, how can societies address it? It's easy to say we need more transparency, and we need for people who notice something is wrong to have the courage to speak out, which means you've got to produce an environment in which they aren't automatically punished for speaking out. It's not an easy thing to fix. Chernobyl, incidentally, happened at an extremely ironic time, because it was very soon after Gorbachev had taken power. He'd had time to launch the slogan that glasnost, transparency. But then when it actually came to the disaster, Gorbachev or somebody at the top hushed it up. And you know that the explosion was only known about abroad when 3 days later, Swedish scientists discovered an unusual amount of radiation in their own air. So it is a big problem. It's easy to think of a solution, and it's almost impossible to put that solution into practice. I'll move down to the next one. How do you evaluate the role of Eurocentrism in the conception of culture that has emerged in the public sphere with the advent of globalization? Do you think there's an asymmetric aspect as for the extent to which cultures bleed into each other, especially considering that some tend to morph into the rest, or perhaps even get incorporated into indigenous cultures more than the others do? I wouldn't be surprised if it had an asymmetric aspect. I've never come across any research that's been done on it, so I can't talk about this on the basis of evidence. But what I'm sure of, and I was sure of this for the 16th, 17th centuries when I was writing about them, and just as I'm sure about it now, is that items of culture move upwards and downwards, not just one way. it's very intriguing how elites pick up certain items of popular culture, just as sometimes it's been suggested that popular culture makes use of second-hand clothes, really, ideas and values that used to be held only by the upper class, and they've somehow gradually sunk, to use the word which folklorists used in the 19th century. Sorry, I can't give you a straight answer to the real part of the question, but then somebody should do research on it. The next one. You mentioned that culture is everywhere, not confined to any specific domain. If culture is truly omnipresent, how do cultural historians decide what to focus on? Also, how can we balance culture's universality with the need for detailed study of the same? Starting with the last question, the way we balance it would be by having different people working on different detailed studies. And there is a place, just as there's a place today for the polymath in the age of specialization. So in any specific field, there is a role to be played by anyone who wishes to make a synthesis, reading all the detailed studies and looking for connections between them. And as to the question that you asked before that, if culture is truly omnipresent, how do cultural historians decide what to focus on? Rightly or wrongly, I think we don't decide to focus on something because we think it's important. We decide to focus on something because it interests us in particular. But since different people have different interests, there's a good chance that if enough cultural historians are at work, they will cover most of the different domains. But I would say, luckily, there is no organization telling us what to write our dissertation on, what to write our next book on, and so on. We can choose it individually, and we do it on the basis of what fascinates us, because that's where, if we like the work we're doing, we'll do it more thoroughly, we'll do it better. Our next one. Composers like Tchaikovsky, Beethoven, and Bach had unique personal lives and beliefs that influenced their music. How do you think their identities and the times they lived in shaped their music? What can this tell us about the connection between music, culture, and politics?
Sir, I'm so sorry for interrupting, but if you would like to stop with this question, we would be perfectly fine with that, considering that we're afraid you might be getting tired. And in case you would not like to take any questions further after you answer this one, we'd perfectly welcome that as well.
So you're saying I should skip that one?
Oh no, you can finish answering this. However, if you believe that you're getting tired of answering the questions, seeing as we have quite a few lined up as well, we can stop after you answer this one.
Only if you're getting tired, so it's up to you.
Yeah.
If you would like to answer all the questions that are there in the chat box.
No. Yeah, I know there are several which I can't see yet because I have to scroll down, which I'm doing one by one.
Yeah.
I seem to have reached the bottom. Then the bottom one is, how could we extract the history of popular cultures entangled in microhistory, as in the night battles of Carlo Ginzburg? If we look at Carlo Ginzburg's second book, which is also about popular culture, the one called Cheese and Worms, we see, I believe, a kind of dilemma that he doesn't admit to. What does Carlo Ginzburg want to do with Menocchio, who is the protagonist of this book, Cheese and Worms, the miller with very unorthodox religious views, who, when arrested by the Inquisition, instead of keeping silent, did the opposite of what most of the other people did, and he spoke for hours about his worldview. Now, the problem I have with Carlo Ginzburg's brilliant book is sometimes, this connects with the question before that I haven't answered, sometimes he thinks that Menocchio is just an individual, that there was nobody else like him in the world. But at other times, he wants Menocchio to be the spokesman for Italian popular culture, or more exactly, the popular culture of the peasants of Friuli in the middle of the 16th century. But surely, the more he is an individual, the less reliable witness he is to popular culture, and the other way around. So I think in that path-breaking book, Carlo revealed a problem which is not just his problem, but the problem of anybody who's working on popular culture. Because the sources are all written by individuals. And at times, we want to speak much more widely. Sometimes we speak about small groups, sometimes about larger groups. But in each case, what's the relation of a text or image which is the product of an individual? What can it tell us about other people? And so, going back to the question before about music, definitely it's a good idea to write the biography of famous composers, because their music is deeply related to their individual characters and beliefs. But it also turns out that there is a period style in music in different places, of course, as well as in particular periods. And if this is the case, then it means that there is a place not only for the biographer, but for the general cultural historian. And then the style of the age is shaped by politics, among other factors. An individual composer's work may be shaped by politics if that composer is interested in politics. For example, Verdi is passionate about politics. He believed in the unification of Italy when it hadn't yet happened. But other composers, I would dare say equally good composers, don't seem interested in politics at all. I don't think you could write a book about the politics of Johann Sebastian Bach. So there isn't a simple answer to the question, but a variety of answers according to the individual or group or period that you're most interested in. I hope that was clear.
Does anyone have any other question? Because otherwise I would like to ask one final question to sum up whatever Professor Burke talked about over the course of his lecture. So does anyone have any other question? Anshu, please go ahead. Wait, can you unmute now?
I think I can unmute now. Can you hear me?
Sir, can you hear Anshu? Anshu, please ask your question.
Okay, sure. So, sir, in your book, The Polymath, you sort of trace the importance of polymaths, right? And in the session, you also mentioned in the beginning that in the contemporary world, you would have hyper specialized knowledge systems that are being promoted in the academic world. So, I just wanted to ask you, given the institutional settings or constraints that we have nowadays, how optimistic are you, for example, if you'd like to say whether polymaths would thrive in the future or not, and how do you perceive their importance going forward?
I believe that polymaths need institutions just as institutions need polymaths. You could say polymaths need a niche. Their niche are threatened today by ever-increasing specialization. In the 17th century, a good job for a polymath was to make usually him, a librarian. Because that gave them a chance to read all the books. And Leibniz, one of the greatest polymaths of the 17th century, was appointed a librarian by a German prince. So, but nowadays, being a librarian is a specialized occupation. So it's another sign of our specialist society. It's not open to polymaths. So what can they do? They have more or less to pretend to be specialists while working on things which are not connected or not directly connected to their specialization. So one needs like special institutions to be founded to allow these people to flourish, because it's probably a good idea to facilitate conversation between one polymath and another. They will spark ideas out of one another. Well, institutes for advanced study do exist, but usually you only go there temporarily. You take a year off from your university, you work on your research, and with luck, you talk to some other people who are interested in it, who you've never met before, and that gives you some new ideas. But for the polymath to survive, there's got to be some place they can go for a whole career. It's an unsolved problem at the moment.
Right. Thank you, sir, for your answer. Once again, I think I'll just ask a concluding question and then we'll move on to the vote of thanks, unless there's any pressing question that anyone would like to ask and receive a response on. Anyone? You can send it in the chat box if, or else I'll move on with the last question then, guys. I don't think anyone's asking a question. Right. So to just as a more overall question, over the course of your talk, which also had kind of an autobiographical element as to how the field of history was when you entered it, there was this transition from, let's say, initially when you talked about how a lot of emphasis was put on political history. And for a fact, I can say that in India as well, the Allahabad school of historians were greatly influenced by British constitutional historians. So for someone who came later, but one example would be Geoffrey Elton, who wrote on the Tudors. So there was this influence in India as well. And then you talked about the rise of cultural history as well. So to ask you a methodological question, for a bit of advice that I think any aspiring social scientist here would love to hear your insights on. How do you see the transition, or how do you evaluate the transition from a more positivist and empiricist brand of history writing to a gradual transformation in which insights from other disciplines have gradually been employed? What methodological advice would you give to a historian currently? And how do you evaluate the recent cultural turn in history writing? So in India, you mentioned Ronojit Guho, who founded the Subaltern Studies Collective. And the Subaltern Studies Collective at one point gradually evolved to have a lot of Saidian frameworks, drawing on Edward Said's work. And we've had a lot of scholars who said that, okay, these historians are using a lot of jargon. These post-cultural historians are using a lot of jargon, which the more traditional brand of historians sort of criticized. So methodologically speaking, since your talk covered this entire spectrum of history writing, what methodological advice would you give to any aspiring social scientist who wants to enter the field of history writing or any allied discipline currently?
I do think that when one is a graduate student, that is the time that one should think about method, and probably it will be the only time one seriously does it in a lifetime. I remember when I was a student, especially a graduate student, yeah, we were sitting around and we were not arguing so much about specific events or specific people, but we were arguing about how we should be studying anything. And were we being given the right method? Is there a flawless method, or does every method have its own disadvantages, and so on? So that's much for the advice side. I think that as far as positivism is concerned, it hasn't been a straight story in my lifetime. I think it was being undermined in the later 20th century. And then it came to a crisis at the end of the 20th century with and in a certain sense, the crisis was resolved early in the 21st century. Not really resolved, because these things are never really resolved, but from a lot of people being more and more worried by problems of epistemology, and even in the empirical subject of history. Suddenly they start relaxing again and saying that none of this stops us doing our work. It may be a bit complacent, but if we're writing the history of the late 20th and early 21st century, then I think you can detect a change in the scholarly climate. So the skepticism at its height in, let's say, the 1990s, and relatively declining after that. And I once amused myself by giving a lecture comparing the 1690s and the 1990s as moments of acute skepticism, not just in philosophy in general, but in skepticism about historical knowledge. And with very curious analogies between the two moments, the two crises. And then people emerge from it, maybe in two different ways, but in both cases, some of the criticisms were incorporated, others were simply ignored, and then that reconstructed style of history went on. So, yeah, your question or questions in the plural spark a lot of observations, but maybe that's enough for the audience at the moment.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Rajneesh, can you unmute for the vote of thanks?
Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, Rajneesh, you are. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Caucus, the discussion forum of Hindu College, I extend our deepest gratitude to Professor Peter Burke for sharing his valuable insight with us today. Professor Burke, your work as a cultural historian and a scholar of cultural and social theory has profoundly shaped how we understand the complexities of human culture. Your reflection on the diversity and unity of cultures, as well as your recent exploration of the social history of ignorance, have offered us a fresh perspective and much to think about. We are truly honored to have had the opportunity to learn from you. Thank you for inspiring us and deepening our understanding of this fascinating subject. We'd also like to express our gratitude to our faculty advisor, Dr. Saurabh sir, for his support in all our endeavors. I would also like to thank all our members and participants for joining us today. Let's continue to work towards a more informed and interconnected world. Thank you once again.
It's been a pleasure to talk to you all.